Hello everyone, my name is Gustavo and I'm here to present the paper A Secure Personal Data Trading System based on Blockchain, Trust and Reputation that's going to be presented by me and Mr. Gabriel Rebelo, who is also a co-author of this paper, together with Lucas de Souza and under the guidance of Professor Otto Carlos Duarte. We start by presenting current data sharing and data access control problems that we find in systems nowadays. And what usually happens nowadays is that with a huge amount of data being created, users usually resort to centralized cloud service to store their sensitive or personal data. What that usually implies to the user is that they lose control over their data because now the data is under control of the cloud storage. They have to pay high fees to use that service and sign terms that compromise their privacy. Moreover than that, the cloud storage is also a single point of failure, meaning that it's susceptible to denial of service attacks and susceptible to data leakage. So the question that we want to answer is, how can we give back to the user the control of their data while avoiding these high fees and preserving data privacy? Also, we want to avoid a single point of failure, so we're looking for a distributed system. How can we achieve that? To solve those problems, we proposed a blockchain-based distributed data sharing system where the blockchain stores all the access permissions in the network so the data owner can know exactly who has access to their data and keep their data under control. What we assumed in the system actually is that the data owner expects to be rewarded. So we created a blockchain marketplace where data owners can sell or advertise their data in the blockchain. And we wanted this system to be as automatic as possible. So we leveraged the use of smart contracts to verify the access conditions and SDN controller to enforce the access policies defined by the data owner. So the way that our system exactly works is that a user interested in advertising or selling their data will issue an advertisement transaction advertising their data on the blockchain, and a user B interested in acquiring those data will issue a purchase transaction and acquire those data via the blockchain as well. And the smart contract will verify if the user B fulfills the necessary conditions to access the user A data, and it will say if the transaction is valid or not. If the transaction is valid, the SDN controller will read the blockchain and will grant access to user B to the data from user A. And that's the system that we proposed, an automated system for data trading. But what we realize is that there are a lot of ways of user A acting malicious. For instance, user A could block the connection after user B purchased the data, or user A could not even have the advertised data that they claim to have. The smart contract cannot verify that because the data is stored off-chain. And moreover, user A could sell low-quality data, for instance, and user B wasted their money on this data. So how can we solve that? That's a problem that we wanted to solve. So to solve that problem, we propose a trust and reputation system on top of the blockchain so that buyers can check the previous interactions that the seller had with other buyers and evaluate if they want to continue with the purchase or not. And we separate trust and reputation into two different concepts, being a trust being a buyer's opinion, personal opinion about a seller, and a reputation being a global view that the network has on a particular seller. And we want this trust and reputation system to follow some rules, like simulating real-world interactions, so we create a model as close as real to the possible. And we want our trust and reputation system to effectively detect and punish malicious behavior. And we also want to mitigate classical trust and reputation attacks, such as newcomer attack, where an attacker creates new identities to continue to misbehave in the network. We also want to mitigate on-off attacks, where an attacker changes their behavior into legitimate and malicious to continue to damage the network without being detected. And the conflicting behavior attack, where an attacker sends conflicting message to different buyers about a seller reputation, for instance. So our question is, how can we model our trust and our reputation to follow these exact rules?
Our system is supposed to provide data sharing in a real world, so it makes sense that our trust and reputation system is inspired by real-world interactions. And that means that positive interactions slowly increase trust, while negative interactions rapidly decrease trust. That way, trust is slowly gained over time, but with one negative interaction, it can decrease very steeply. It also means that recent interactions matter more than past interactions, just like in real life. And in our model, we have a term that if the interaction was positive, it has a positive value, and if the interaction was negative, this term has a negative value. And the negative value weighs way more than the positive value to account for that difference between positive and negative interactions. We also have an adaptive forgetting factor that mitigates on-off attacks. This forgetting factor accounts for recent transactions being more important than past transactions. And in our case, we propose it to be adaptive, which means that if a seller has a high probability of being malicious, this forgetting factor will weight its negative interaction even more, so it gets punished even more rapidly. And we feed that model into a nonlinear function called the Gumperz function to simulate real-world interactions. So the Gumperz function defines the trust of a buyer I and a seller J, and that's a local trust. It's dependent on the opinion of buyer I. Seller reputation, on the other hand, is supposed to represent a global view of the network regarding a single seller, so it does not depend on the opinion of a specific buyer. And for calculating seller reputation, we use the eigentrust algorithm, which was proposed by Stanford a couple of years ago, and we adapted it to our context. Basically, the way the algorithm works is by making each user ask its acquaintances about a seller to discover its reputation. So here we have TIK, which stands for the trust of any user I in a seller K, and we want that to become a reputation that's a global view. In the eigentrust algorithm, we make that by asking our acquaintances. So CI1 stands for the trust of user I in user 1, and CI1K stands for trust of user I in user K. So if I'm a user and I want to discover the reputation of another user K, I ask user 1, which is my friend and my acquaintance, and I'll weight his opinion by how much I trust in him myself. And we do that for all the nodes in the network. And in the end, if I ask for the opinion of all participants, he will have the global view of the network about any participant K. That's the idea of the algorithm. If we rewrite that into the matrix form, we see that the trust of a user I in a user K actually corresponds to the trust of K's immediate neighbors multiplied by the matrix of the trust of any node in their neighbors. And for those of you who are familiar with Markov chains, this corresponds to a stationary Markov chain. TIK being the current state, C being the probability matrix, and CIK being the initial state. So that means that if the number of interactions is large enough, or in this case, if I ask enough friends, and they ask their friends, this trust vector will converge to the same reputation vector regardless of the initial state. So it doesn't matter how much I trust on seller K, if I do that process over and over again, I will reach a global vector which represents the reputation that seller K has in the system as a whole, weighted by all the nodes in the system. So we use that as the reputation.
After modeling our trust and reputation system, we still need to integrate it with our initial proposal of a blockchain-based data trading system. And to do so, we propose a feedback transactions so the buyers can rate sellers through the blockchain. We use the blockchain to store these ratings so that information is publicly available to everyone in the network. That way we can effectively mitigate conflicting behavior attack, which is a classical trust and reputation system attack. That happens when an attacker provides different information to each neighbor in order to harm a legitimate seller's reputation. So if the information is publicly available in the blockchain, that is not possible because everyone sees the same information. In our feedback transaction, we provide two fields that so the buyers can rate our seller. The first one is the buyer's rating on the seller, which the buyer can choose two options, either 0 if he had a negative interaction with the seller, or 1 if he had a positive interaction with the seller. That value will be later passed to the trust and reputation system to feed the Gompertz function that we saw in the previous slide. And the other field is the justification field, which the buyer can use to justify his rating, so that everyone sees why he's giving a rating of a negative interaction or a positive interaction. That's how we integrate our trust and reputation system with our data trading system that we discussed in the beginning of the presentation. But now we are going to take a look in the whole system, the complete system that we proposed. Now that we've seen every component of our system, we have to put them all together to see exactly how data sales work in our system. First, we assume that the data owner has already uploaded his data on a storage server, and we assume that his data is encrypted in order to prevent the storage server from having access to his private or personal data. The first step of data sales in our system consists on the seller issuing an advertisement transaction to the blockchain. And these advertisement transactions contain important information such as the price that the seller is charging to grant access to his data, and the type of the data that he's selling, if it's a data collected from a medical sensor or a smart city sensor, for example. The advertisement transaction also contains the IP address of the storage server where the data is stored. That is important because the SDN controller will later use the IP address to connect the buyer to the storage server where the data is stored. The second step of our data sales in our system consists on the buyer querying the blockchain for advertisement transactions until he finds a data that he wants to purchase. Once he finds this data, he can check for the seller reputation in the reputation system and issue a purchase transaction to acquire the data. And this purchase transaction contains the buyer IP address so that the SDN controller can use that to connect him to the storage server. But that does not conclude the process of acquiring data because, as we said before, the data is encrypted in the storage server. So the buyer needs the decryption key to have access to the data. So a seller needs to issue a response transaction, and that response transaction contains the decryption key encrypted using the buyer public key. So only the buyer will have access to the decryption key once it is encrypted with his public key. And now that the buyer has access to the decryption key, he can request access to the storage server, and the SDN controller will read the blockchain and see that the buyer has access to the data that he purchased. So in order to do that, the SDN controller reads the purchase transaction and see that it's valid. And once the SDN controller sees that it's valid, it will allow the buyer to access the data stored in the storage server. And the final step of our data sales in our system consists on the buyer evaluating the seller on the data that he purchased. So in order to do so, the buyer issues a feedback transaction or an evaluation transaction containing two main fields, which is the buyer's rating on the seller and a small piece of text justifying the rating that he gave, if it was a negative interaction or a positive interaction with the seller. And that concludes the data sales process in our system.
To implement our prototype and our proposal, we used Hyperledger Fabric. Hyperledger Fabric is an open source platform for building permissioned blockchains. And in that platform, we wrote smart contracts in Go language to implement our system. Our experimental setup was ran in an Intel i7 CPU with 32 gigabits of RAM and 12 processing cores. And to verify how our trust and reputation proposal works, we used MATLAB to simulate real-world interactions that would occur in such a scenario. In our first experiment, we wanted to evaluate how an on-off attack would occur in our system. So in an on-off attack, we expect an attacker to constantly change its behavior in order to perform malicious actions without getting severely punished. In this experiment, we evaluated trust of a seller of a buyer I and a seller J using two types of forgetting factors: a static forgetting factor of 0.99 versus our adaptive forgetting factor. And what we see is that in the first phase, when an attacker is behaving honestly, its trust grows steadily in the static forgetting factor. But in our adaptive forgetting factor, it grows more rapidly because our system rewards sellers who always behave honestly. But in the second phase, the attacker starts behaving maliciously. Then, with a static forgetting factor, its trust will drop slowly, but with our adaptive forgetting factor, its trust goes to a minimum level very rapidly. In this phase, the system is punishing the behavior of an on-off attacker. In the third phase of an on-off attack, the attacker will try to recover its trust by behaving honestly once again. So with a static forgetting factor, it will actually surpass its previous trust and fully recover it. But with our adaptive forgetting factor, its trust remains at a minimum level for a longer period of time, so that he has to perform more honest actions than malicious actions. Otherwise, the attack is just not worth it. And what we conclude from this experiment is that past negative interactions heavily impact the trust of a buyer and a seller. So on-off attacks in our system are not worth it because we punish malicious behavior. In our second experiment, we evaluated the reputation of two sellers in the system. One is an experienced seller who already has a high reputation, and one is a newcomer seller who wants to build reputation and attract more clients. So in the first phase, we assume that the newcomer is selling twice as much data as the experienced seller because he has a very good quality of data. So in this case, the reputation of an experienced seller will drop slowly, and the reputation of the newcomer will grow slowly, and eventually the newcomer will surpass the experienced seller. But in the second phase, the experienced seller starts to behave maliciously to prevent the newcomer from surpassing his reputation. And what happens is the system punishes him even more. The newcomer will rapidly overcome the experienced seller in that case. And finally, when the experienced seller has already been overcome by the newcomer, it acts honestly once again, but now the newcomer already has more reputation than the experienced seller. Conclude by that the experienced seller cannot always rely on his or her experience to preserve his reputation, and thus we incentivize sellers, whether they're experienced or not, to always sell good quality data and receive positive feedback.
So concluding, we proposed a trust and reputation system to secure a distributed blockchain-based data trading system. And our trust and reputation system was modeled to simulate real-world interactions while mitigating at the same time common trust and reputation attacks such as on-off attacks, conflicting behavior attacks, or newcomer attacks. Moreover, we implemented and evaluated our proposed system, and we saw that the system effectively detects and punishes malicious behavior in the network. Thank you all for your time.